AB 32, the Global Warming Solution Act of 2006, authorizes ARB to implement a market-based mechanism to limit greenhouse gas emissions. This is a new area for ARB. To learn more about market-based mechanisms, we are bringing in a series of experts to educate us. Dr. Burtraw is the first speaker in this series. We want those who have gained expertise in designing, implementing, and managing market-based mechanisms to share their insights with us. What lessons can we learn from market-based programs that have been developed elsewhere, both in this country and internationally? Dr. Burtraw, a senior fellow at the Resources for the Future, has particular expertise with emission allowance allocation and with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative for the Northeast states. Dr. Burtraw earned a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan in 1989. He also has a Master in Public Policy degree from the University of Michigan and a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of California, Davis. Dr. Burtraw has studied the design of incentive-based environmental policies in the electricity industry and has authored extensively on the performance of emission trading programs in the United States for sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, and on the performance of the European Union emission trading system for carbon dioxide. He currently serves on the EPA Advisory Council on Clean Air Compliance Analysis and on the National Academies of Science Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dallas Burtraw.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'll mention that what Resources for the Future is, where I'm come from working in Washington, D.C. It's a nonprofit research institute. It's about 53 years old. It's a lot like the Brookings Institute or one of the other think tanks in Washington, D.C., but we like to think we're one of the ones that has managed to hang on to independent status and middle ground while financial pressures as much as anything else pull a lot of these institutes in one direction or the other on the political spectrum. We fight our fights internally with each other, hit each other over the head, but try to come out with information that's reliable and can advance the public policy dialogue. It is really nice to be back here because I'm from California and I come out here often because of family, and I used to work for the state of California with the SolarCal Local Government Commission back in the early 80s. Okay. Is it tough? Okay. Okay. Does this work? Let me know if you have any trouble hearing me in the back. Okay. Well, you're probably all more familiar with the context in California than I am, but just by way of background, I want to make sure that you appreciate the task that's before you. This graph on top, which I got, Alex Farrell at UC Berkeley actually collected this information. And it shows where we are today in California with electricity imports excluded, with electricity imports included. And these are the goals under the Climate Action Plan. This is where baseline would be taking you according to trends. And this is where you want to be by 2020 and where you want to be by 2050. It's quite an ambitious target. And this pie graph here represents an inventory of sources of CO2 emissions in the state. And Alex Farrell has indicated here where the major sectors in the economy that are likely candidates to be inclusion, at least in the first phase of an emissions trading program. There's currently 4 initiatives for CO2 trading underway around the world. One is the EU emissions trading system. It began in 2005. The first phase goes through 2008, and then the second phase is going to overlap the first Kyoto compliance period. And their goals there are to be consistent with compliance with Kyoto. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these later in the talk. The second is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, which involves seven of the 9 original states are still involved. Massachusetts and Rhode Island are at least temporarily not participating anymore, but they're widely believed to re-examine and probably to rejoin after the first year. And then Maryland state legislature and governor has signed legislation to join. So it's now 8 states participating in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which will take effect in 2009. It's more modest than the EU ETS or than the California plans, but it has some very nice design features, some very nice innovations in terms of the way that that's been organized in my mind. Then third, we have here in the California context, where you have really set the standard for long-term goals for what might be achieved and hopefully will be achieved. And then there's a flurry of federal U.S. initiatives which deserve some attention. So my roadmap for this presentation is to give a little background on the story for CO₂, which was sort of the first large-scale example of emissions trading, and then talk about some of the other programs as well. Talk about some special issues that have come up under these programs, and one of these is price volatility, and I want to talk about the role of banking and safety valves and other things. I want to talk about innovation and the importance of technological innovation and how trading programs complement other types of technology standards and are not replacement for other types of other standards in my mind. Then I want to talk about the gorilla that's in the room with us, especially with CO₂, and that is allocation. That is the initial distribution of emission allowances under a trading program. Then we'll take, as time allows, I'll go through program designs for these 3 programs that exist and then summarize with just a brief idea about basic architecture. Okay. So by way of background on emissions trading. Cap and trade program provides sources with the flexibility to determine their appropriate strategy and to make their own decisions about how to make emissions reductions, when to make emission reductions, and where to make emission reductions. But all this is under the rubric of a firmly established and enforceable social goal, social commitment that's going to be monitored and enforced by the government. So it leaves a lot of decisions up to individual firms and takes advantage of the so-called asymmetric information problem that usually is a struggle for regulators to try who don't have the same information, private cost information that many individual facility plant managers and firms have on their own. It works better when the program can be simpler if there are uniformly mixing pollutants. And it may not work as well and wouldn't be as good of a candidate for a policy design if there was a lot of concern about the geographic specificity of damages or where emission reductions needed to occur. Now, these programs can be layered with different types of trading ratios, et cetera, to provide incentives to get reductions where you want them. But there's a trade-off that I'm going to sort of a Faustian bargain that I'm going to keep coming back to about when you add complexity to these programs, is it worth the metal? And there comes a point where the complexity can be too much. Yes, the economics literature is full of examples and nice design ideas about how you could put in controls for geographic control over where emission reductions are going to occur or not. But as those become proliferated, you start to ask the question, is it worth doing a trading program or are there other options? So this grows out of a tradition in the U.S. of prescriptive regulation, and indeed, to this day, the vast majority of the Federal Clean Air Act still uses prescriptive regulation, and it has been very successful, very effective in many situations, especially where control or reduction options are obvious. It establishes what needs to be done and when and how each source is going to do it. With this as a backdrop, in the early 1980s, many regions of the country were in non-attainment with federal air quality standards, national ambient air quality standards. And this put government environmental policymakers in a situation that no one wants to be in, where really there was a direct conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. And the reason was that it was so difficult to cite new sources where a new plant was going to open up in some existing area if that area was in severe non-attainment with the NAAQS. So that led to the innovation, it was a legal and policy driver for the innovation in the 90s of bubbles, offset programs, and credit programs, which provided some flexibility. So for example, if a facility was going to reduce emissions from one process or close one boiler, then maybe they could site another boiler at that same facility. And then that broadened a little bit to have some sort of within a geographic bubble, if you will. There were offset ratios associated with this where maybe you had to reduce 1.2 tons for every ton that you were going to be adding at a new facility. And the government still had to be heavily involved because there was a lot of concern that there not be paper credits or anyway reductions because the facility was going to shut down anyway. Given that you're in severe non-attainment and you're trying to do everything you can to make annual rates of progress, should you allow a new source to site at that facility? So there were high transactions costs with these kinds of programs, and they fell short of goals that economists had been championing about how well we could do if we use this kind of approach. Transactions costs were usually in the realm of 35 or 40% of the value of an economic transaction. That was the cost associated with brokering the deal and getting all the regulatory approvals. The SO2 program was initiated under the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And it was really a bold new experiment because it really cast government in a totally different role vis-a-vis industry in terms of regulation. It set a maximum aggregate emission level and then refocused government roles on monitoring and enforcement. And as a consequence of this, and we're going to talk about the SO2 program a bit, but for example, one outcome of this is the transactions costs associated with individual trades fell below 1%. So less than 1% of the value of any kind of trade that between a firm that's going to reduce its emissions and a firm that's going to increase its emissions, as allowed to increase its emissions as a consequence, the economic cost of negotiating that transaction has gone down tremendously, as has the administrative burden. And the folks at the US EPA love to tell you that program was put together with a staff of 50 people, which was just, by 2 orders of magnitude unprecedented in terms of what they were able to put on the ground. And today it's maintained by a staff of a dozen or so people. A huge program that has had a huge environmental impacts. What I'm going to say about questions, by the way, is if there's some point of clarification or you really got to get something out of me in order to understand what I'm talking about, stop me. Otherwise, I'm going to try to get done so there's plenty of time for questions at the end. But don't hesitate if you need clarification. Well, let's see, did we get this? Okay, why a cap and trade program works. Well, the idea is that it limits emissions and maintains those emissions into the future, providing market value on emission reductions so that basically a ton saved is $1 earned. There's a value to reducing the use of emission allowances on site now, and that value is maintained out into the future so that it's not just a matter of achieving some emissions standard and then being there, but that there's an incentive to even go further, to overshoot, because a ton saved is $1 earned, and you can sell that credit to someone else in the market. So it creates incentives to continue to lower costs going forward. So there's a limited supply of emission allowances, and there's a demand for allowances, and this is what creates the scarcity value of those allowances, and it puts a price on the opportunity cost of doing emissions. This comes in addition to whatever type of regulatory performance standards might be in place, technology standards associated with new sources or existing sources in order to meet the SIP requirements for attainment in a specific jurisdiction or a quality management district. So it creates these economic incentives to reduce reductions into the future. And there's 3 sets of key features associated with the successful design of these trading programs, I think. One of them is setting the emissions cap levels to protect the environment and that still has some sort of technological and economic feasibility and provides predictability to the market participants. This is what, a lot of virtue in this, and you can see that I'm touching on stuff that is the regular controversy associated with any kind of standard making or in some of these issues. I also want to say that many of the controversies associated with cap and trade program, I think can be resolved if you step away from some of the cap and trade controversies and come back to this point, setting the level of the cap. So when there's concern about this or that, about a trading program, I'll talk about some of them. Those concerns deserve to be fleshed out, but in the end, maybe you want to give something to industry, come back to this question. Let's talk about the cap. And if you can give additional flexibility to industry, you get it back for the environment by reducing the cap over time. Second, and this is really what's really key, is that this does not minimize or trivialize the role for regulators. Accountability on emission reductions has been absolutely key in order to get public confidence in the program in the first place. So you need accurate and complete emissions measurement and a transparent emissions and allowance data system. The US EPA has done a phenomenal job with this, with the SO2 program and then with the 22-state NOx trading program that is in place now in the North and East states. And you need complete and consistent enforcement, predictable penalties if you're out of compliance. And this has led to virtually 100% compliance in the SO2 trading program. One exception to that was, as I understand the anecdote, about 4 years ago, there was a firm that had made a mistake in their reporting material. The EPA managers were on the phone at 8 o'clock at night trying to find the authorized representative at this firm to get them to fax in the correction on this. They couldn't do it. That firm got fined $25,000 or $50,000 for being, just temporarily out of compliance, and then they had to surrender some allowances as a consequence. But that was strictly an accidental accounting error. With respect to the environmental integrity of the program, the goals have been achieved, and that's verifiable. And then it's really important, as I said before, to pay attention to simplicity in the design and the operation of the program. You need minimal but effective governmental role. Okay. In this context, what I mean to say is that if you put a program in place that it gets increasingly complicated and the regulations start, that provisions in the trading program start to resemble a U.S. tax code, you've gone the wrong way. That the reason that these programs work are, first of all, they provide flexibility to the industry, but secondly, they need to be transparent and simple, if you ask me, in order to get the environmental advocacy groups to buy into the program. Because if you can't figure out what's going on and you can't really see where emission reductions are occurring, and you can't tell about whether stuff is being monitored and accounted for properly, then it erodes public trust in the program. And the more complicated the program, the more likely that is to occur in my assessment. Okay, so just quickly retouching these, I mentioned measurement already, and the key thing here is accountability. These slides are in your packet, but there's a little more thought on it there. And we talked about data systems, and I really encourage you to be in contact with the Clean Air Markets Division at the EPA if a trading program takes shape in California and you want to see what state of the art is in terms of transparency and data management. And thirdly, with respect to enforcement, I've already mentioned that the enforcement at the EPA has elicited great confidence, and this has come on a pretty minimal amount of administrative costs. Now, I've been around long enough to remember when the program first took effect, which is a funny thing to say, but now I've been around that long, so I can say stuff like that. And the media reactions to the SO2 trading program at first were, well, as you look back, I can smile. At the time, they were, quite discomforting. One thing on APOR story was the quote, "What's next? The LA Police Department trying to buy civil rights credits in Wisconsin?" Or "Why applaud a deal that lets companies buy pollution rights?" Well, indeed, you can see that this is motivated by the environmental ethic that clean air and a clean environment is somehow a right that property right, if you will, rests with people, with consumers or citizens in the state, and so they want this right to the clean environment. It was even, you can't read this, of course, but they managed. Tom the Dancing Bug managed to have some fun with this about crimes, the tales of market-driven crimes when this stuff was, first coming into the scene. But I want to give you this, I think, a practical perception of trading. First is that it is true that cap and trade lets firms trade the right to pollute. But you need to hasten to add that cap and trade requires firms to pay for something that previously they got for free. Firms have always had the right to pollute, and now you're putting in place a system that makes them pay for that, makes them recognize an opportunity cost associated with those emissions, and provides an incentive to drive those emissions down further. So that's where you're getting with the flexibility that's in the program. Prices complement policies, but don't replace them. I put that in here because there's always characterized as, well, should we do this or that? I don't think that that's the way any of these programs have been successful. Both go together. And also, a point that really has to be emphasized is that emission allowances have tremendous value. And so who is going to be the recipient of that value in the initial distribution? Well, okay, with all that as way of background, this is what the performance of the SO2 program was. So this picture shows that from 1980 and then passage of the Federal Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, this is the total level of aggregate SO2 emissions from electric utility sources. The trend, there was a decline expected here, and then there was expected to be an increase out by 2010 to about 17 or 18, 19 million tons a year by 2010. That was what was expected in the baseline. The blue bars here represent phase one affected sources. Those were the 110 or so big, dirty facilities, mostly in the eastern United States. And then in the second phase, which begins in 2000, all SO2 emitting facilities greater than 25 megawatts are affected under the program. And then this red line, these red dots, represents the annual allocation of emission allowances to the affected facilities at that point in time. So beginning in 2000, the allocation increased because the phase 2 facilities came into compliance and the allocation to phase 1 facilities was reduced. And what you see here is this difference between the red line and the blue represents what caught many people by surprise, and represents what was one of the early successes of the program, was dramatic over-compliance by the affected facilities. By 1995, they dramatically reduced their emission reductions, and many people, including myself, have spent a lot of time trying to ask why, how did they do that? But the why of it has to do with the fact that they had an incentive to do so, that there was a reward to early emission reductions because they could bank these emission reductions. And so that's what the difference is between these red lines now and emissions by going into the future. And you see this bank getting used up, and most of the models suggest that by around 2010, the bank will be used up entirely and will be in a steady state equilibrium where annual emissions equal annual allocations. Okay, now the costs of the program have been much championed. In 1990, the EPA expected the annual cost of the program to be about $5.7 billion. 4 years later, by 1994, when everybody was waking up to the fact, oh my gosh, people are looking under the lampposts and there's a lot of savings, and some people have decided to look elsewhere away from the lampposts, and they're finding some more savings. So the estimates were that saw costs falling. And then 8 years later, including our work at Resources for the Future using econometric work, we find that the annual costs of compliance are and this is in phase 2, full implementation of phase 2 would be just about $1 billion per year. And this has been achieved because of competition. The number one reason I think about this is that this trading program, because of its breadth and transparency and flexibility, it has unexpectedly put different types of compliance option in competition with other compliance options. So, who would have thought that some large engineering firm that was working to improve reliability, removal efficiencies of SO2 scrubbers, or the amount of hours of the year that the facility can be online, would be thrown in direct competition with a railroad company who is designing DC trains that were mile long and where they would helicopter in the engineers of the train, so that the train never had to stop, because the whole system was organized to move low sulfur coal as far and as fast as possible at dramatically reduced costs. So with these economic incentives in place, there were multiple ways of compliance. They all were thrown into competition with each other, and the outcome was a lot of economic efficiency, as economists would have hoped. Okay, so now just keep this in mind for a moment, because I want to suggest a puzzle, or a conundrum at least. Cost nearly as low as $1 billion per year. And the health benefits of the SO2 program alone are just tremendously significant. They're estimated in 2010 there'll be about $50 billion a year in annual health benefits, 10,000 premature deaths avoided. This does not include the benefits of reduced acidification, et cetera. So this is trumpeted as a 50 to 1 or more. Sometimes the EPA uses more generous numbers actually than we do in our benefit cost work. So they'll say 100 to 1 benefit cost ratio. That's great, but you got to stop and ask yourself, whoa, what is there something about cap and trade programs in particular, or about regulation in particular, that would lead us to have a 30 or 50 or 100 times benefit cost ratio and then not do anything more? I mean, does that mean that's where you want to be? If benefits are estimated to be 50 times greater than the cost, then does that suggest that maybe we should be doing more than is in the program currently? And I want you to keep that conundrum in mind, because it plays a role in terms of the design of cap and trade programs. Yes, please. The question, I'm repeating the question because it's for the webcast. The question is, are we talking about costs in terms of costs for all affected sources that are required for compliance, or are there some broader notion of costs? Now, this is an estimate of the compliance cost, full compliance cost for all the sources affected in the industry. It does not include things that you might find in the economic public finance literature associated with tax interaction effects and things like that. We've actually looked at that separately, but this is the most conventional way of thinking about costs, a partial equilibrium notion of costs. Okay, yes? okay, the point was to cite how CO2 and methane might be different from SO2. So yeah, we're going to get to that, I hope, in just a minute. But first, I do want to mention this, this next issue, which was a big controversy in the SO2 program design, which had to do with the spatial effects of trading. So this, gets at something that's really key in the California debate, I know, is environmental justice. The question of whether or not everybody's being affected fairly and equally under the program. And it was a real serious concern in the SO2 program. Originally, the program divided the nation into two markets, and there was not going to be trading between these two markets. But finally, in the last pass through the Senate, they took that distinction away because they thought the economic gains from unifying the market were greater than any notional sense about what the justice gains or local and environmental gains would be from having some, making sure that there wasn't a hot spot or something like that. And so this continued to be a controversy through the 90s. The New York Assembly was active in taking a stake on this, and Senator D'Amato actually likened long-range transport of acid rain to airborne terrorism. So we took a look at this, and another group of scholars at Clark University have taken a look at this question about the effect of trading on emissions. And I just want to put this up for a second while we're still on SO2. So we looked at the effect of, given the aggregate reduction in emissions, which leads to $50 billion estimated in health benefits alone, if you will. If we had achieved this level of aggregate emissions, what would have happened if you had not allowed trading compared? What was the effect of trading? So we ran our economic simulation model linked to integrated assessment model and see that, well, there is an effect of trading. The red states, that's what you would expect. Some states end up over-complying, and other states don't comply as much as the average overall sources. So the red here shows where there has been emissions greater than average, or emission reductions less than average, if you will. And then this next slide converts this with an integrated assessment and atmospheric transport model to estimating the effects on human health. And the red areas show areas that received less than average benefits, if you will, and the blue areas show are areas that received greater than average benefits. And it turns out serendipitously in our analysis that more people live in the blue states here than in the red, and so as a consequence, on net, there was a little bit of actually environmental benefit in the aggregate from allowing trading. My compatriots at Clark University who have looked at this found just the opposite, but we're in very much agreement on this point. The difference is very, very small. And we're talking about annual change in benefits of a couple $100 million plus or minus, less than 2% of the aggregate benefits under the cap and trade program. So they, like us, agree that basically this is second order, that at least in the context of the SO2 trading program, and we can talk about what the features are of SO2, the context of the SO2 trading program, the flexibility associated with trade, which allowed the political compromise in 1990 to be achieved, the swamp any kind of local environmental consequence associated with the geographic location of emission reductions. That would be my public policy perspective on this. But this is not going to be true for every pollutant. And so it's an important thing to keep in mind. So now to wrap up, what sort of lessons from SO2 are there for greenhouse gas control? I'm just wrapping up. Don't get your hopes up. I'm just wrapping up on the first part here. We still have quite a ways to go. Okay, general lessons. Emissions trading can be effective, and it may be even more appropriate for greenhouse gases because there's no hotspots. However, there can be, I actually know that there's going to be some discussion about that, so let's save that for a topic that we should talk about at the end of this talk, where there might be hotspots associated with some aspects of methane control, as I understand, and other issues. But at least thinking about CO2 per se and its effect on the environment, there's not from the CO2 emission, and there might be hotspots associated with the choices made to reduce CO2, but for CO2 per se, there's not a geographically specific effect on the environment. Specific elements from the SO2 program that deserve attention are the role of banking, the transparency and monitoring and verification, and the political and economic importance of allowance distribution, and those are items that I'm still going to come back to. But what might be different for a greenhouse gas system? The scope and point of regulation might vary. You might choose may or may not choose to regulate at the generator level in the electricity sector, for example. There's much higher stakes for the initial distribution of emission allowances, raising the question of auction versus free allocation. There's a lot of interest in mechanisms to limit price uncertainty, including safety valve type of issues. There's multiple gases and the question of accounting for sequestration. And then there's the question of aligning a state or federal program, for that matter, to anticipate possible participation in with the international system of some type. Okay. So next I want to talk about price volatility and the role of banking and safety valves. Well, almost all emission markets have been successful so far, but poor attention to design of anything can ruin it, and whether you're talking about designing a building, an electricity market, or an allowance market. And one type of key problem is this price volatility. Many previous programs have lacked flexibility mechanisms to dampen price volatility for allowances, and some for good reasons. Reclaim has very limited, only overlapping compliance periods was the only type of price mechanism to control volatility in prices. And the NOx program has very limited, the NOx program in the Northeast states has very limited banking with what's called progressive flow control. It just devalues banked allowances over time. And the reason for doing this is a concern that there were going to be episodic environmental problems that might come if there was a particularly hot day and you had a dumping of a lot of allowances into the market on that day because of a spike in emissions. So there was a concern of the temporal, the time at which emissions would be used, would be added to the environment. Nonetheless, price volatility has been a big issue in these programs. So this represents price paths in 4 different programs. This is the SO2 program here, which actually had banking and actually had a pretty flat allowance price for a long time until passage of the CARE rule, the Clean Air Interstate rule, which then caused, for reasons that we don't have time to get into, caused the value of allowances under the current Title IV program to potentially be enormously valuable in the future. So that's what's driving this phenomenon out here. This is the Reclaim program where we saw the infamous price spike in 2000 and then suspension of trading for electric utilities, for electric generators in 2001, temporary suspension. This is a path of NOx prices in the Northeast SIPCAL program. SIPCAL program which replaced the Ozone Transport Commission's program and subsumed that program. And then this is the price path in the EU ETS, and what they're calling Black Monday was allowance prices fell by half one morning for reasons that make a very interesting anecdote in their own. Excuse me? This is the price of a ton of CO2, a metric ton of CO2. Right. Okay, so there's mechanisms that are talked about to provide intertemporal flexibility that are thought to dampen this kind of price volatility, including safety valves and circuit breakers and intensity targets. And then banking and offsets are sort of distinguished because they, unlike the first group, would preserve the cap. And the first group sort of are ways of relaxing the cap in dire circumstances. And the second, banking and offsets, would preserve the aggregate cap over time when viewed over many years. The advantages are price stability, and they may increase efficiency in the program, but there are disadvantages. It reduces the ability to mandate or anticipate any particular technology performance, and it may reduce the symbolic value of the program, and there can be unintended consequences of these kinds of caps. Well, the Reclaim experience, you all in the room are going to know more about this than me, at least many of you will. But it was a program that began in 1994, was expected to be fully implemented by 2003, and it affected any facility emitting 4 tons or more of NOx or SOx in the South Coast Air Quality Management District. This is what happened, price path in the market, and the blue line is for NOx prices, and you see this precipitous increase that was commensurate with disruption in the electricity market. The reaction to price increase in Reclaim was the suspension of trading, which I've already mentioned, and effectively removing utilities from the market. And why did these NOx prices increase in such a precipitous way? One is the demand increased faster than expected. 2000 was a low hydro year, and there had been previous few years had been relatively low investment in electricity generation, waiting for rules associated with the restructured electricity market to be sorted out. So sources had not made early capital investments and that were expected, like SCR and other types of controls at plants. All this really is pointing to one thing. There was an absence of banking in the program. And what that meant was that we had just-in-time emission reductions in the reclaim program. There was no economic incentive for anyone to do anything before they had to, because you didn't want to incur capital costs before it was necessary to do so. There was no reward for it. Emission reductions in an earlier year were squandered. They were, the tons saved weren't worth anything, and you were paying a cost on capital. So any independent financial decision maker is going to try to delay that capital investment until the last minute. And it just so happened that the period in time where some of those capital investments were expected to happen was coincident with a time where there was a shortage of supply in the electricity market, and so those facilities could not be taken offline. And so we had just-in-time emission reductions, and the time at which that was going to happen in 2000, 2001 was an unfortunate one. So the role of banking is in the SO2 program, as it appears in the SO2 program, may have helped ameliorate this considerably. It's thought to have contributed significantly to the SO2 program's success because it gives incentives to firms to reduce emissions earlier than they have to and below required levels, and ensures that those emission reductions all have value. And also, it had one other very important and subtle role. Banking in the SO2 program, I mean, I actually, I'm the zealot of the recently converted, because I wrote considerably in the early 90s about some problems with banking and problems with the allocation under the SO2 program. But what actually, from a political economy perspective, what happened on the ground was that industry woke up to the fact that they were vested in tens of millions of dollars in assets in their allowance holdings in the bank. And some EP managers have told me that they are, to this day, really surprised at the fact that there was so little litigation around the SO2 trading program. And one of the reasons for that was that the companies realized that they had a vested interest in the smooth implementation of that program, because they were holding on. You saw the size of that bank before, and they were holding on to a bank that was going to have value in future years. So it created a situation in which the industry was really interested in seeing this program turn out to be a success. Even though banking has its virtues, Reclaim decided the risk of variability in emissions was too much in order to allow banking, but this is going to be an important consideration for sure in designing a program for California. Okay, now let's talk about safety valves, which is the other thing that's much talked about, goes by many different names. Many different things say the term safety valve is used to describe many different things as well. The safety valves are motivated when there are, let me start again. The idea is that when there's fixed targets, that you cannot respond to new information like, for example, a spike in natural gas prices or something like that might lead, or a low hydro year, that might lead to some type of unexpected price volatility. Now, what a safety valve would do would be if there's a price ceiling that's put in place, a one-sided safety valve, as it's been mostly discussed in the literature. If there's a price ceiling and if a value of emission allowances hit that ceiling, additional allowances are put into the market. I think of it as though there's a window at the Treasury, and for some price level, you can go up to that window and buy additional emission allowances, as many as you want. But that price at which that is set is well above the expected price that you're expecting to obtain in the market. So that if the price in the market spikes up to some real high level, you might go and buy additional allowances. So an inherent attribute of market-based policies that is really different than anything you've had before in other regulatory approaches is that you have instantaneous feedback about marginal costs of compliance. That is, we would refer to the price of an emission allowance as a summary statistic of all the private information that's held throughout the economy, and represented in that price is more information than regulators have ever had available to them before, because every private decision maker with private information is responding to that price in the market and making decisions, and those decisions are in turn affecting that price. So a safety valve embodies a decision rule on how to respond to the change in price. Was there a question here? And it causes an inflation in the cap. It causes emissions above what the original cap was set to be. No, they might be different people to characterize this in different ways, but in the general literature, the stuff by Billy Pizer, who's a colleague of mine at RFF and has done this seminal work in the economics journals about this, the idea would be that it'd be a one-time infusion of additional allowances into the market. We have some ringers in the room, I see. The question is there some analogy to financial markets where investors take risks in face of tremendous uncertainty all the time, and so are there hedging funds and other types of derivative products that might allow the financial community to step in and provide the kind of assurances to industry and absorb this risk of potential large volatility in the market? Your observation is very well made, and so that is something that should be considered as an alternative. But so far in the large markets, even in the EU ETS, there is not yet a major role of the financial companies in terms of providing these kind of financial instruments. And I've been a little bit surprised by that, because we certainly would expect them to emerge soon, given the value of emission allowances in the EU ETS. In the SO2 market, nothing more sophisticated than forward contracts ever emerged. There never was an options market or anything like that. So that could be that the programs so far have been too small to really motivate the financial firms to come in and provide those kind of services. Maybe that would be different in a CO2 program, but maybe the California program by itself won't be big enough to allow that to happen. Maybe a national program would. Those are considerations. Good points. Okay, so we've seen what happens with price volatility. We've seen an unexpected price rise and reclaim, had unfortunate consequences. But looking over all these programs, unexpected price falls have been much, much more important in economic terms. And I want to talk about the SO2 program in particular, because if you look at what the expected costs were and expected marginal abatement costs, which were going to drive allowance price, that allowance price fell from expected value of, just speaking roughly, of $700, fell to in the neighborhood of $120, between $120 and $160, and stayed there for several years. So you saw this precipitous fall in marginal costs in the SO2 program, and as noted previously, we saw huge benefits in that program. But the problem was our feet were stuck in cement. It literally would take an act of Congress to change the statute, because the cap was set in statute, until finally the CARE rule came along, which was a very complicated regulatory decision to try to supplement the Title IV by tightening SO2 measures further. And so the economic magnitude of the fact that the cap was not able to adjust, if you imagine a symmetric safety valve where there was not only a ceiling, which has been the controversy, and many environmental advocates have criticized safety valves for the fact that you would be adding additional allowances to the market. If there was also a symmetric floor in which, in the case prices fell, and it turned out the technological optimists and engineers were right, and that they could do all these things, and so the price fell, then there should be sort of an insurance policy, not just for industry, but an insurance policy for the environment. And you accelerate the environmental goals over time, and there'd be some kind of reduction in the cap by reducing the provision of emission allowances in the future. And if this kind of thing had been put into Title IV, even at 33% below expected allowance values when in 1990, it would yield $1.5 to $2 billion a year, based on what was expected in 1990. Based on what we know now about public health associated with sulfates, fine sulfates, it would really be on the order of $8 billion a year is what would be saved under the SO2 program. So what we have here is an unexploited opportunity that's unique because of using incentive-based regulations. And you get this signal about a marginal cost of compliance. And regulators might want to anticipate decision rules that can respond to that. Okay, let's see. I mentioned that the one-sided safety valve has unintended consequences. And those are that one is it expands the emissions cap and sort of breaks or violates the ambitious environmental goals in the first place. The second is that it reduces the incentive for investment in new technology, because An investor is looking, say if you're an investor, you're looking at a new wind farm or some kinds of innovation for technology, you're expecting a distribution of potential payoffs. And it turns out in our, I think in the real world, and I know in our simulation modeling, that it's actually the high-end, the small probability of high-end payoffs that really drive the expected value of payoffs for R&D research around renewable. That's where the greatest value is. It's sort of asymmetric payoff distribution for investments in new technologies and research and development. And so if you truncate that by not allowing the price of allowances to go above a certain point, you're actually truncating the payoff value for investments in new renewables. And you would expect, and some of the environmental groups like Environmental Defense have made a big deal out of the fact that this safety valve is pernicious and that it will actually undermine our investment in renewables, and that's exactly what we want to see in order to get compliance with emission reductions. So the idea of a symmetric safety valve is to give back this insurance policy to the environment in the same way that you give it to industry by adding a floor. And I already mentioned the potential savings in the SO2 program. So I just want to show you that in our research, what happens with these safety valves. So this is, we run a highly parameterized, detailed model of the U.S. electricity system that breaks the country up into 20 regions and does capacity planning and dispatch in an iterative algorithm. And this is just the influence of these kind of price control mechanisms in the context of our model for 2020 under a CO2 policy. So you see that indeed, and there was probabilistically, there was going to be, the safety valve is going to be invoked in some years, and that's going to lead to additional emission allowances put in the market, and you're going to break the cap. The cap is no safety valve set by this blue line. Symmetric safety valve on an expected value basis would return you to environmental objectives. Welfare measured in economic terms, which most people in the room here wouldn't really want to hear a lot about, the safety valve actually has huge benefits because it triggers at a time when there are short-run disruptions in markets, and it reduces price volatility, and as expected, that has welfare benefits. Symmetric safety valve grows those benefits even more. It returns electricity price to its expected value under the program where there's no safety valve at all. It brings allowance price back up, and importantly, it brings renewable generation back up and actually exceeds, because what you're doing with a symmetric safety valve is reducing the variance while preserving the mean associated with new investments, and that's usually thought to be the kind of thing that attracts investors. So I want to put this bug in your bonnet for one of the issues that is very much current in the federal debates in Washington now, and I think should be part of your considerations here. Okay, next. We're going to talk about technology and innovation. And I want to say that allowance value inflates energy costs. And when do you want that to happen for consumers, and when do you want that to happen for industry? But there's no getting around it. That's what a cap and trade program is going to do, is it's going to inflate costs associated with using energy. And for firms, in my mind, in the short run, capital is fixed, but there still is value in seeing inflated costs associated with the opportunity cost of using emission allowances, because there are many times low-hanging fruit that are available, and also this kind of signal allows the fusion of technologies that are already ready to come off the shelf, be put into place. But the impact on consumers is a different thing altogether. It is, while we like to see economists would like to see a value of emission allowances passed on to consumers so that it gives them an incentive to buy energy efficient air conditioners, etc. In the short run, and similarly, if you think about what would happen if we were to expand a cap and trade program to the transportation sector, in the short run, there's little that households can do about this, and because they're stuck with a capital stock, and you're going to pay a high political price for imposing costs on consumers in the short run. So one way to potentially reason your way through this is to think that you want to gradually phase in the price effect of a cap and trade program over time. But in the long run, I want to argue strongly that prices play a really important role in rationalizing investment decisions throughout the economy and really add a lot of efficiency in terms of complying with environmental goals. And if you go back to the first slide I showed you, the goals are very ambitious. And if you try to achieve those goals without doing so in an efficient way, there's going to be they're going to be very, very difficult to achieve. So that, I think, is a motivation for why we're looking at cap and trade programs in the first place. But I want to emphasize that this doesn't undermine the role for technology, but complements the role for technology. So again, by analogy to what happened under the SO2 program, let's look at the story of integrated gas combined cycles, something that people are still talking about a lot today for how we're going to get electricity generation in the future from coal in a way that's clean and carbon can be captured and sequestered. In 1990, the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program came out with its integrated assessment after spending $500 million studying the SO2 program. And they predicted, well, we don't have to do anything. We don't need the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments because there was going to be large-scale entry of IGCC by 2025. And so you'll see in this picture that this is aggregate economy-wide, even outside the electricity sector. There's the electricity sector, there's aggregate SO2 emissions. And by 2005, there's going to be a dramatic influx so that by 2010, there's going to be 73 gigawatts of IGCC built. And we're just going to be on this downward path. SO2 emissions were going to be ended just by technological change. And this was the basis for the view that there was no policy intervention needed or any kind of cap and trade. It was argued vociferously in Washington in 1989 and 1990. But Congress decided otherwise in 1990. So what happened? In the SO2 program, we saw very modest allowance prices. And it provided incentives that affected behavior in the short run. SO2 emissions fell much faster than the reference case, but without the big technological fix. So actual emissions fell like this. This is what they were expected to be without the acid rain program. Innovation occurred through multiple small discoveries. And so this straw man of the IGCC, well, do we need to wait for the big fix? The question is, what are we going to do? This is, given the statement that California has made now about what it wants to do, this may be less compelling. In Washington, D.C., I think it is compelling that we're still just one generation away for IGCC. So in 2005, we were expected to see, it was expected to enter the market on its own, and you still hear folks say that IGCC technology is one generation away. I think that IGCC will be real, and it better be real because it's going to play a really key role in how we're going to achieve carbon goals in the future. But in the meantime, we need to find cost savings away from the lamppost. And this is done, in the SO2 program, this was done through a series of small measures and small decisions once the incentive to do so was put in place. So we saw a dramatic drop in low sulfur transportation costs, an increase in investment, diffusion of new technology, fuel blending turned out to be several times more practical than people thought, and a number of other types of small-scale, typically non-patentable technological changes led to dramatic reductions in costs and dramatic SO2 reductions. Yes? This one? The next one? Sorry. Yes, I think the question is, looking at this picture, that the gray line represents without any acid rain program or any particular controls put in place at all at the national level for SO2 emissions, except for those that already existed on new sources. And the green line represents the trading program. And the question is, well, couldn't you put in some other kind of regulation other than trading program to get to the same place? Absolutely, you could have. There's nothing magical about the trading program. There was about 73 pieces of legislation considered in the 80s that would have regulated SO2 in one form or another. And it was finally the trading program that achieved the political compromise that got put in place. And the trading program was very successful because costs turned out to be so low. But I'm a critic of the trading program because we see that benefits are two orders of magnitude greater than costs under the trading program. Shouldn't we have gone further? But there's something about the design of the trading program that made it inflexible to that kind of new information. Could a prescriptive technology standard, could we just have mandated scrubbers at all these facilities? There was the Waxman-Sikorsky bill in the 80s would have called for that. It would have been probably 2 or 3 times more expensive than the SO2 trading program. It still would have had huge benefits associated with that. How do I know about that? Well, that's my professional judgment, because there were studies done by Edison Electric Institute that I've read, by Hagler Bailly, I think, on their behalf. And then we also have done modeling about scrubber costs, and factoring in what I know happened to the cost of scrubbers. One option would have been to mandate scrubbers at all large facilities. Another was the SO2 program, which provided an incentive for many scrubbers to get built, but not nearly as many as the Waxman-Sikorsky bill would have. But what the SO2 program did was that it enabled low sulfur coal to penetrate the market in a way that was wholly unanticipated. So, and that and a number of other kinds of things, like the role of fuel blending, mixing low and mid sulfur fuels in the same boiler. They didn't think that could be done practically. It turns out it could be done, but no one ever really had an incentive to try. I've heard from folks at EPRI that the same experiment was done at dozens of plants, where plant managers said, well, what happens if, let's get some low sulfur coal, let's try it. And then they did all sorts of measurements and, oh, we can do this, it turns out. But before, no one had ever had the incentive to try to look for that kind of flexible compliance. And I could go on because I've sort of cataloged these low-hanging fruit that were existing at a lot of these facilities, and it turned out that there were a lot of low-cost reduction options possible. But yes, technology could have taken us to the same place. I'm confident that it would have been more expensive, but the benefits would have been equally as huge, and the benefits swamp costs no matter how you did it. Let me keep going, because I'm getting near the end, and then we can open this up for a more general conversation. I'd love to see my straw man fall over twice. Okay. Okay. So this just is something you've already seen, basically the trend, and particularly interesting is this reduction in intensity of SO2 emissions in the electricity sector that was achieved. Okay. But trading isn't the only way to go. This graph has probably been seen by all of you before, and you should take some pride in the fact that it's internationally famous. This information about total electricity use in California. Since 1960s, it was basically overlapped the national average, and since then, while the national average of per capita electricity use has continued to grow in sort of a straight line manner, the California has been flat for nearly 3 decades. How did that come about? Well, first of all, I want to tell you that we have some healthy dose of skepticism. So we looked at this and go, well, it's got to be because California has a more moderate climate. So we thought, well, let's take a look at cooling degree days, and so we got the data from NOAA and aggregated, and to my surprise, I thought, well, more and more people moving to the southeast. It's got to be that more and more people are moving to where you got to run. There's a higher air conditioning load. That's why the nation has to go up and California gets to stay flat. But it turns out no. It turns out the national average for cooling degree days per capita has remained flat over the last 2 periods that we've compared here since the 50s, but it's 9% higher in California because of the influx of population inland Los Angeles and in the Central Valley. So actually, that accomplishment is even more astounding given this context. And there have been a number of policies put in place, not economic incentives directly, but policies have been very successful for getting us there. So this graph taken straight from the California Energy Commission staff shows the different kinds of programs that have gone a long way. But policies have gotten us a lot of this, but policies haven't done all the work. There's also been higher prices in California. So right around the time when California decided that it was not going to site any large new power plants in the state that were fossil fired, electricity prices separated from national average and have remained higher ever since. And that has led to a different attitude about end-use efficiency also. So you see sort of it's a great dissertation to try to disentangle whether policies or prices have had the greater effect here, but both have been in effect in terms of seeing that remarkable performance of flat electricity consumption per capita. Question? The question is, are we separating industrial and other sources of electricity use from residential use in there? And it's been so long since I put that, it's been a year since I put that graph together, I can't remember off the top of my head. So I'm going to take a dive on that question. Maybe someone else in the room knows, because we recreated that dive from that graph from the data, but the California Energy Commission staff have had that graph around for a long time. So, yes? Okay. So I think it does include industrial, but recognizing there's been some change in industrial characterization in California over the same time period also. So yeah, there's been some benefits, but some things that have complemented it. Okay. Well, so I've been emphasizing that prices are important in promoting incremental progress, and I just want to take one example. Usually it's not a good thing in a presentation to read something, but I want to read this to you because I think it summarizes my entire experience in studying the SO2 program. This from Ed Rubin and colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University in a recent comprehensive study they did on the history of R&D in this country over 100 years. They conclude that if only because radical innovations are uncommon and unpredictable, incremental innovations are the most appropriate policy targets. Despite their portrayal in papers and elsewhere as critical events, radical breakthroughs in scientific or technological knowledge generally are less economically significant than the lengthy series of incremental innovations and improvements necessary to arrive at a cost-effective product that is attractive to users. An appreciation of incremental advances is essential to the formulation of policies for fostering innovation. And prices, a price that you get out of a cap and trade program supplements this nicely because it provides a reward for diffusion of mature technologies. But prices are not going to do the work. In my mind and in the mind of most economists, this is an open controversy, but most economists, I think, would conclude that, if you set prices high enough, prices will do all the work. But in the real world, basic R&D is not going to be sufficient through private sector incentives alone. And you need government involved directly, public university system involved directly in that. And you need, when it comes to things like Art Rosenfeld has famously talked about for decades about miscellaneous compliance and cell phone chargers and aquariums and other things that are just nibbling us to death, that you need standards in order to reconcile that, because you can't really get the signal strong enough to get the information to let consumers make decisions about their cell phone charger, when actually collectively we have a collective action problem. So there's a key role for standards, but there's a key role for prices because it helps us capture the low-hanging fruit. It affects end-use decisions for large capital purchases, and it provides rewards for investors in the market also, and those who can harvest emission reductions. So I want to suggest that a possible strategy for California is to phase in sectors affected by the cap and trade program, allow and encourage early banking, and add a symmetric safety valve. And now I want to talk about initial allocation and the phase-in of an auction, because that will also have an effect on the timing of how prices get rolled into the California economy. Question in the back. Symmetric safety valve, yeah. Okay, so the question was, it seems like I'm advocating for a symmetric safety valve, or its consideration at least. But the SO2 program was pretty successful, and it didn't have a safety valve of any type, so what is my reasoning exactly? And my reasoning is that the SO2 program was successful in achieving its goals, but its goals were, and if you will, even suspend disbelief and imagine that Congress was so rational as to set a standard where benefits roughly balanced with costs, and that reflected society's willingness to pay for emission reductions in 1990. That information was rapidly out of date. And economists and anyone who logged onto the EPA website could see that as the price of emission allowances fell steeply. I got touched by that. I thought I was being pretty smart, pretty aggressive when I entered the first auction and bought one for $290. And pretty soon the market clearing price was down around 110. And you didn't need rocket science to understand that this is turning out to be a lot cheaper than we thought. And the next question an economist wants to ask is, it's turning out to be a lot cheaper than we thought. Shouldn't we respond to that? Should we buy more if it turns out to be cheaper? A symmetric safety valve provides kind of a decision rule. And what I'm arguing is it's revolutionary in market-based or incentive-based programs, is that for the first time you have a signal about about what the actual costs of compliance are on an instantaneous basis.
If I can just try to boil that down maybe more into layman's terms, it seems like what you're saying is we could have gotten down well below 10 million tons, and we could have done that very cost effectively with the benefits still outweighing the cost. So, why did we set it so that Congress set it so we got stuck in at that 10 million tons when we would have been very justified in going much lower?
Yeah, for the purposes of the web. So we were locked in at 10 million tons, and it turned out to be cheaper than we thought. And why didn't we go further? Why were we locked into that? Well, it wasn't uncommon. I mean, cap and trade program wasn't unique in this regard. Any kind of regulation typically has something like that, though not always. There might be rates of progress and stuff built into some other regulatory design. But in any case, Congress didn't have available to it the policy tools that could allow it to incorporate this new information in 1990. Today, I think we understand these things well enough that they could be built into the fundamental design of a program. Build in the flexibility to go lower in the future and to accelerate the pace as information suggests that you can afford to do that. Yes?
I'm relating to Jim asked this, but I can't picture the negative thinking or the lower thinking of what happens when the price goes low.
Okay, the question is how do you really picture a symmetric safety valve? What happens when the price goes low? When the price goes high, I suggested that the government may decide to put additional emission allowances onto the market. When the price goes low, the government may decide to reduce the provision of allowances. If there's an auction for some portion of the allowances on an annual basis, they could reduce the number of allowances that were being put in the auction. They could decide to reduce the amount of free allocation that's being going to be allocated in future years. And if there's banking in the program, we would expect to see immediately in the current year a reflection in the price of allowances if there's a change in future year allocations, because the bank serves to reconcile over time the value of emissions. Let's stop this now and let me go a little bit further and then try to get to the end so we can have a better wide open conversation. Okay. Now I want to talk about allocation. And the reason that this is so important is that we are talking about something that's wholly unprecedented. So this represents the allowance value of the NOx and SO2 programs. That is the price times quantity on an annual basis. It was roughly $2 billion per year. This is a wholly new, this is a new, they call it federally created intangible property right that didn't exist. There was no value there previously, and now it was, if you will, value made out of clean air. You suddenly had this new value. For carbon, in order to achieve to comply with Kyoto goals, according to one EIA study, it would cost they would create an allowance value of $450 billion per year. In some simulation modeling that we did, in order to just get a 6% reduction in the electricity sector nationwide, it created allowance value of $15 to $24 billion. That's basically the total market capitalization of Duke Power, one of the largest energy companies in the country. And this would be created every year. So who's going to get, we are talking about a new institution. I really want you to hear me on this. We're talking about an institution of the order of magnitude of the Oklahoma Railroad land giveaway. We're talking about a transfer of wealth that has, rarely even had precedent in U.S. history. So it really deserves attention. Who is going to get this? And let me now, for the next two slides, there's going to be more economics, though simple as can be, than I've had in this presentation. But I want to convey to you why CO2 is special. It's not just that CO2 is so ubiquitous in the economy. That is true. But take a look at this picture, please. And what I've arrayed here is, this is a percent of emissions. So as you move this way, you get fewer emissions and more emission reductions. And the SO2 program aimed for roughly a 50% reduction in emissions. Okay, this is a marginal cost schedule. So the further you go, the more expensive it gets for every ton that you reduce. And the resource costs for achieving emission reductions are, the integral under this, or the sum. You spend this much for the first ton, and this much for the second ton, and this much for the third ton. When you add all those up, you get a triangle that represents the resource costs with achieving roughly a 50% reduction in emissions. And so the value of the emission allowances is the marginal cost, which becomes the price of emission allowances, times the quantity that exists in the market. And we're going to issue emission allowances roughly equal to 50% of where we otherwise would be. This rectangle is the allowance value. CO2 is special. While that rectangle is roughly 2 times the cost of emission reductions, for CO2 in the early years, we're going to be talking about reductions of 5 to 10%. And so the value of this rectangle is roughly 20 times the value of the resource costs. And then recognizing that the scales are entirely different, you get the sense that whoever gets this value that's being created is getting something that's hugely valuable and much more valuable than the actual resource costs that are being used to comply with the program. Okay, and the next point, which is just a little bit technical, but let's just try to drive this in home, is that, so this allowance value gets reflected in product prices, one way or the other, in most situations. And so this is just a stylized picture of how electricity prices get set. There's variable costs and variable cost ordering, which usually is just fuel and variable O&M. And then now there's an allowance value. There's an opportunity cost with using allowances because, well, let's say you're just within the firm. If there's two facilities within the firm, if this facility is using the allowances, there's an opportunity cost to this facility not having them. So that you would expect to see the dispatch order of which facility gets used first to generate electricity, reflecting that the opportunity cost of those emission allowances. And when you think about total cost then, those allowances, however they were acquired, are added into a total cost calculation at their opportunity cost value, because the firm could turn around and sell them to someone else. So the firm could go out of business and they would be left with this thing of enormous value. So they're gonna charge their customers. They're gonna, just if they happen to be sitting on top of a big pile of low sulfur coal, they're gonna charge for its use. They're not gonna give it away for free. But the allocation offsets that in thinking about total cost. If they've acquired these allowances for free, then it may largely offset this. And in a regulated electricity sector, you would expect to see regulators, and this is the way it worked in the SO2 program, valuing emission allowances at original cost, and the original cost was roughly zero, and since in the SO2 program they were all given away for free. So what we see is that the price under an auction is going to be more than the price if allowances are given away for free. The variable costs does not depend on the allocation, but in regulated electricity prices will depend on the allocation. How these emission allowances are given away is going to matter a lot. And the key idea that people have trouble holding on to here, maybe it occurred, maybe everybody in this room gets it, maybe you get it now, but 15 minutes later it's not going to make any sense anymore. But what does it mean that that a firm will charge for something that it got for free? But that's what economists have convinced themselves is what we would expect to happen. And we're not alone in this regard. There's evidence in the real world that that's the way it happens. So this is a picture from the Nordic power markets that are now under the influence of the EU emissions trading system. And this just is a graph overlaying changes in the Nordic markets, changes in electricity price and the value and the price of emission allowances over time. And you see them moving very closely together. So even though these electricity companies got these emission allowances for free, they're bidding into the market reflecting the opportunity cost of using those allowances for electricity generation. So that's just a really important point to hang on to, that in a competitive market, at least, you'd expect to see these things get priced and passed on through in cost to consumers. In a regulated market, it's going to be different, and that's going to be one of the most interesting and profound issues to sort out here in California because of the withdrawal, because you now don't have retail competition anymore at the retail level in the electricity sector. We essentially re-regulated here in California. And so this leads to thinking about this enormous value. And we talked about how SO2 and CO2 are different. There's sort of different points of compliance in the economy. And so one of the fundamental questions is going to be where in the stream of emissions from upstream fuel producers to downstream end users, where in the stream are you going to locate the point of regulatory compliance? And the crucial lesson of everything I say today, the thing I hope that you'll remember is this observation, that a crucial architecture for CO2 is to distinguish the point of regulation or compliance from the point of allocation. They could be the same, but they do not necessarily have to be the same. And in all previous trading programs, they have been. But now the stakes are much, much higher as we move into CO2, and there's no reason in economic theory why they should be the same. And I'm going to argue that principle should guide allocation rather than some notion of entitlement. And you better rely on principle, because otherwise there's a lot of value at stake, and it's going to devolve into a contest of self-interest trying to guide climate policy. And what that principle should be, I think, is efficiency overarching everything else. And we've got the most expansive environmental policy. I could go on and on about that efficiency. There's a voluminous literature, technical literature in economics about the origins of why an auction is more efficient. But basically that's the bottom line conclusion, is that an auction is much more efficient than free giveaway. So it introduces this trade-off between free allocation and an auction. We're looking at the most expansive environmental policy ever faced, and free distribution will multiply that cost dramatically. So absent a public policy rationale, and this is the point, absent a rationale, there's a strong economic case for using an auction. Well, Schultz's book in 1977, which I studied in public policy school, The Public Use of Private Interests, puts up this axiom for policymakers that government should do no harm or do no direct harm in sort of upsetting the social contract. The government shouldn't just come in and cream somebody because of a new rule, but should try to smooth the transition and try to help everybody in the economy. I'll say that the economic literature broadly finds that there's significant efficiency advantages to using an auction, but why might allowances therefore be given away for free? Rather than viewing it as an entitlement or just a cat fight, let's look for a rationale for giving away for free, and I think there are three. One is compensation. But keep in mind that 100% free compensation can, as we saw in that picture of the rectangle and the triangle, can dramatically overcompensate firms. You can give them away to load-serving entities in the state, and that will serve to compensate consumers. And there might be a lot of merit for that, at least in the short run, but there's other issues that surface, and we probably don't have time to get into all of them today. But the second is to promote specific technologies. So there's ways that the initial distribution can be designed in order to promote the use of certain technologies. And the third is to promote competition. That is, for example, here in the state, leakage is one of the big issues everybody's talking about, is that your electricity generation in the state is going to be put at a disadvantage compared to electricity generation out of state, because in-state generation is going to be saddled with opportunity cost of CO₂ allowances, and you're going to try real hard and be only somewhat successful to figure out a way to also halter the sources out of state. But the initial allocation of emission allowances can promote electricity generation in the state and thereby promote competition and protect the sources that are in your economy that are being regulated under the strict environmental measure, and not put them at any worse economic disadvantage than necessary vis-a-vis sources that are unregulated in neighboring states that might be in direct competition with you. So there's ways of designing allocation schemes that get at all three of these goals. Okay, now here's where we're at in my presentation. I've only got 10 minutes left, and what I was going to do was fly through a discussion of the RGGI program, the EU ETS, and I think I don't need to do that. But there's a graph up ahead that I want to get to. So first of all, let me just talk rather than going through the slides, and I can summarize, I think, what you really need to know about the RGGI program and the EU ETS, and then I'm going to go on ahead to a final couple slides. The EU emissions trading system was put in place in 2005, and I mentioned it goes to 2008, the first phase, and it affects about 45% or so of CO₂ emissions in the European economy. It's really remarkable. But it also has, in my mind, some design flaws, and it was put together at a breakneck pace. I mean, in 2003, they had the go-ahead to design this program, and it was on the ground in January 2005. And one of the ways they did this was there was a lot of compensation given to electricity generators, and there was a buy-in of in particular, it's often pointing to the German electricity producers who, in order to play ball, they wanted certain provisions put in place. And the most unfortunate provision in my mind is that it defies any public policy rationale except for getting buy-in of the affected parties, is that there's a ceiling put on the amount of emission allowances that can be auctioned, a ceiling of 5%. And that's the rule that governs all member states. So basically, the allocation to initial distribution to affected sources is left to the member states, but they can auction no more than 5% in phase 1 and no more than 10% in phase 2. And this, even at the same time, the European economics literature isn't real much different than the US economics literature, and they're finding that auction would be much more efficient. So what is the thinking that led to them putting a ceiling in place when what we would probably expect would be kind of a prisoner's dilemma where each member state would race to the bottom in order to give away as many as possible in order to entice new generation and new economic activity in their nation compared to their competitors? Well, that's exactly what we've seen, is given a ceiling of 5%, everyone has chosen 0, except for Ireland, bless their hearts. And so there was no real rationale why they put the ceiling except to protect the German electricity producers. Well, as a consequence, probably the single biggest controversy in the EU going forward has been the so-called windfall profits that have accrued to electricity generators in the orders of billions of euros per year. There's numerous studies that we could talk about. I think I've cited a couple of them in here. The UK Royal Commission determined matter-of-factly that electricity generators in the UK had earned €1 billion were earning €1 billion a year in windfall profits. The number has been estimated much higher for Germany. Another study by some Dutch economists looking at the Dutch-Belgian lowland electricity generators are finding the same thing. So in the second phase, now there's been some rethinking and a little bit less generous allocation going to electricity generators in the first place, but they still have this ceiling on how many emission allowances can be allocated. In the Northeast states, I said that the RGGI program has done a number of things that are innovative and are really, I think, is a really improvement on the model. And I think that you're going to have in as a future speaker, Franz Litz, who's been the chair of the staff working group uniting the staffs of all the states in the Northeast, have been working diligently for 2 or 3 years now. He's really great, so that's really good. But one thing I want to draw attention to that they decided was that instead of putting a ceiling on how much could be auctioned, they put a floor. And they said, they recognize that there's a prisoner's dilemma, they recognize there's efficiency issues here, and so they said that a minimum of 25% has to be auctioned by every state. So still the model there is that the states get to allocate to affected sources, but at least 25% of the allowance value has to be withheld for an auction. And the auction revenue has to go to public benefit purposes, including promotion of specific technologies and compensating consumers, maybe through energy efficiency programs or low-income support programs. Well, as it turns out, I think the literature has been more influential in here than we had hoped in some regards. And so New Jersey has talked a lot about wanting to auction 50%. Elliot Spitzer, the presumptive next governor of New York, has said that they want to auction 100% of their emission allowances. So we've seen a dramatic turnaround. It shows that once it sort of penetrates the idea of using an auction for the initial distribution and all the efficiency gains that it offers, has a lot of legs, and because it gives, what it does is it gives regulators an enormous amount of allowance value, and that allowance value can then be used for broad-based compensation to reduce the labor income tax. That's what economists always want you to do. But regulators in the Northeast are saying, well, we're going to use this to target technology programs and things like that, and that also makes a lot of sense. There's a number of other features about those programs that can be talked about, but we don't have time because I want a lot of questions. So I do want to jump ahead to one other slide. And so let me just click through this quickly. Okay, whoops. And say, now I'm just going to talk about some modeling we did. Maybe I'm just showing off our good stuff here, but what's going on at the federal level, and also to convey indelibly, if possible, an impression about the importance of the initial distribution of emission allowances, because I think that's what I have the most to offer in terms of helping you understand. Well, we've done simulation modeling of CO2 policies. Here we're looking at the Bingaman proposal, which draws on the National Commission for Energy Policy. It's very moderate compared to what California is doing, but it is nationwide. And we find that consumers really realize the greatest loss, but the harm is quite diffuse. Electricity generators get hurt, but the measure of that harm depends on the yardstick that you use. What do I mean? I mean, how electricity generators are hurt depends on the yardstick. And this is a picture I want to show you. Imagine here that we have a RAID. Here, a change in market value for all sorts of different sorts of windmills and nuclear power plants and gas stations and coal stations, et cetera, around the country. And some of them are going to be winners and some of them are going to be losers. And under this national proposal, the Bingaman proposal, we find that losing facilities are going to lose about $50 billion in net present value terms under this very modest climate policy. That's a big hit. Some of these guys are getting creamed. But there's winning facilities, and that the winning facilities, like efficient natural gas combined cycle units that have been built in the last few years, are going to see an expansion of market opportunity. They're going to see an increase in electricity prices. And this is even with a very small auction. They're going to see a lot of an increase in value. So a lot in the industry, the first thing you're going to hear is folks coming from the industry, not being misleading, genuinely concerned that they have a facility that's going to get creamed. And you think, we got to do something about them. But you realize that plant managers or facilities are not stakeholders in this context, in the financial context. firms own portfolios of facilities. So you need to take a look and see what happens at the portfolio level. And so if you look at the portfolio level, we'll see that assets get organized at the level of the firm. And some firms are going to be on net winners and some firms are going to net be losers. And when we organize the information this way, we find that there's firms that lose money of about $14 billion. And they're sort of instantaneous, if you will, decline in market value on Wall Street. And other firms are going to gain about $5 billion in value, so that the net effect is actually around $9 billion in terms of the cost. So the kinds of questions that this motivates is, well, how much compensation should be justified? How would you target that compensation? And how can we use the initial distribution of emission allowances to compensate these firms? I would suggest that this is a bona fide call for some claim to compensation. But if you try to give away $141 billion in order to address $9 billion of change in market value, you're going to give a lot of windfall profits and a lot of excess undeserved compensation when there's a lot of other valuable claims for that value in the economy for R&D programs or tax relief, broad-based, or what have you. So this is you really want to try to get at this with a scalpel and try to limit the amount of overcompensation to the maximum degree possible. Okay. Allocation review, all that about allocation. Compliance, responsibility, and allocation should be thought as with separate questions. The emission allowance trading program is going to create a lot of winners as well as losers, and the initial distribution of emission allowances can have a large effect on efficiency and the distribution of costs. So I basically have one slide to wrap up for my suggestions, point of departure for basic architecture. The fundamental divide is whether to do voluntary or binding CO₂ programs. And there is a lot of talk about voluntary cap and trade, and there is examples of that, and I'm not a fan of it. I am a fan that we've learned, that a lot is learned from the organization of those programs, but I really don't think you can ride that horse very far. It's more important to start early than to start big, because this puts an incentive and signal in place now for R&D and for investments that are going to be made now and going forward into the future. And it gives us time is an element of compensation in and of itself. So if industry knows what's going to happen, that gives them a chance to over time rationalize their investment decisions. It's more important to end on an economy-wide basis than fighting too hard to try to start there. So you can phase in various sources, but by 2020, when you're on a path that may be very steep, it may be that we'll be looking very, very hard to make sure that transportation was included in receiving the same kind of price signals that other sectors of the economy are receiving. But as a point of departure, although I'd love to see it, I'd love to see the ideas on how it would work, most people feel that including the transportation sector initially doesn't make sense. There's more to lose than to gain by doing that. You can address compensation needs through allocation, but do so carefully and let the process be driven by principle rather than by a contest of self-interest. And efficiency is essential as constraints tighten. So in conclusion, climate change is a long-run problem, and the design of these institutions are going to matter significantly. We're in the business here nationally and in California is very much at the lead of designing an institution that's on the order of magnitude of Social Security for how it's going to affect our children and our grandchildren. And I'm not just talking about the environmental implications. I'm talking about the governance institutions that we're putting in place. So I think it needs to be taken very seriously, and I'm really glad that California is taking the lead on it. Okay, I'm sorry that I've gone too long, but yeah, I'm here, so I'm happy to take further questions. I'll leave it to you. Sure. I want to say, first of all, I'm not going to be, please feel free to leave, folks who have to leave, because everyone's busy, and we were going to end at 11:30, so, but I'm here to stay.
Just one observation about the price floor idea is I realize it actually may be an alternative to banking. I can imagine in the reclaim program, for example, if there was a price floor of $3 or $4 a pound of NOx, that it would have given enough incentive for the investment to have created installation of those facilities. that
I
were needed
agree.
for the reductions. So
I agree. There's
that's
a-
an alternative as
They
well.
sort of is a complementarity to banking and also a substitution for what banking does. I agree.
One thing different, is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. One thing different about the carbon market is that there will be a lot of things that are really hard to measure. For instance, the sequestration or the energy conservation programs or things like that of exactly how much carbon is avoided. And as you think of program design, do you think of doing things like looking at the variance of the measurement and taking that into account as opposed to just the expected value in carbon training so that you penalize more variance and also because there is a cost trade-off in how precisely one estimates these things?
I don't have anything to add to that. I agree with you that yeah. I don't know if you have further ideas specifically about how we would address that, but that's a very good point. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned that there is less likelihood of hotspots being created as a result of greenhouse gas trading, but the experience in the EU ETS, is that if there's poor enforcement, in a country with poor environmental performance, there could be those types of problems. And with California's experience of reclaim, could you elaborate on ways that carbon trading could be designed to prevent hotspots or the potential ways that it could happen if not prevented?
Yeah, I think we should, if there's other questions on this topic also, we should maybe talk about this for a couple minutes because I have as much to learn as to offer in this regard. My observation, my statement is really motivated by a very simple observation, this isn't the final word. CO2 as a pollutant doesn't offer a threat with respect to environmental justice or hotspots because, well, actually, if all the CO2 was emitted in this room, we would asphyxiate. That's true because it gets into your bloodstream and it takes the oxygen out of your blood. So if CO2 levels was heavily concentrated in one, that's the bubble in the lake in Africa, for example, it causes massive release of CO2. But we're nowhere near from any industrial sources that there would be such a concentration of CO2 that would have CO2 as a unique pollutant would have any localized effect. There's not really any important reason to think that. So CO2 is the best case. If there's any good case to be made for a cap and trade program, CO2 is the example of that. Methane has some other issues, and others are going to be more knowledgeable about that than me, and so I welcome you to add on to that. But I will hasten to add, to make your point, that I understand that there are things that might be done in order to reduce CO2 that could indirectly have emission consequences around emissions that we're concerned about, around VOCs or around NOx or something like that, some sort of substitution in technology or use of different fuels or it could be very pernicious if there was a use of some type of, let's say that a facility decided to use a lot of biomass, and biomass was determined to be CO2 neutral because as much CO2 is being taken up from the atmosphere as is being released in its combustion. So it might be sanctioned under a greenhouse gas trading program, yet it could create a hotspot for NOx because of all this combustion. And so you have maybe some old industrial boiler in some urban area, and all of a sudden a lot of people are getting exposed to new emissions. I'm not saying anything that suggests that that's not a major concern. There's got to be, and there is in California, of all places, a whole suite of existing policies to protect against local hotspots and address environmental justice issues, and none of those should be undermined by the addition of a cap and trade program. I only mean to say that in addition to all those things, if we now decide to regulate CO2 under a cap and trade program, in addition to standards for CO2 and all sorts of other things, that try to keep that program as simple as possible, because CO2 by itself doesn't have a localized effect. Does that help? Or do you want to follow up? Why don't you follow up? Because usually the follow-up is...
Yeah, just that, no emission of CO2 is without concomitant pollutants, and we just have to make sure that, existing law is strong enough to prevent increases.
Absolutely. So the point, the CO2 has co-pollutants, and we've got to make sure... You may have your doubts about existing law, and so I think sometimes an advocacy perspective is to use every regulatory handle to fight the battle, because you're constantly fighting a battle, and so now CO2 is the battle that you're going to fight, and try to use it to achieve environmental improvement in your community generally. And I don't begrudge you for trying to do that, but if the program gets too complicated as a consequence of that, it may not be worth doing CO2 trading. It might be worth just, I think that would be a huge mistake, because I think that regulators can't see all the information that private decision makers can see, and that's the argument for CO2 trading. But right, it depends on the fact you have strong enforcement for other pollutants. I totally agree with you.
Hi, I'm Mike Scheibel. I'm a deputy executive officer here, and I just want to make a couple of comments for you and then to the group. I'm actually bullish on CO2 trading, and obviously we're going to set up something under the program, and with this governor it's going to include a major element of cap and trade. But our past experience, I covered the reclaim program, was involved in its inception, was involved in the torturous 2 years during the energy crisis when it and the electricity market imploded on each other, and I think we had $5 to $10 billion in extra cost for electricity during that time. And I don't think the reclaim market was a failure of the market designs per se. It was a failure on launch. And what happened on launch was emissions were grossly over allocated to protect against unwanted environmental effects. And that had two really bad consequences. The first bad consequence was the environment suffered. We substituted an effective command and control for a market-based program, which eventually got us the same thing, which eventually should be cheaper, but during the 6 or 7 year implementation period, cost environmental progress. Saved money, but cost environmental progress. And the second was, it gave out the signal prices were too low, and therefore investments were deferred, and so when emission controls were needed because of the energy crisis, they weren't in place, and you couldn't put them in place quickly. So we've got to learn from that experience. The second experience we've had with the market was the California electricity market, which means that as we go forward, we're going to have intense issues, I think, with every sector trying to convince them, well, what have we learned, and how do we do this right? And the other perspective I guess I have is, you got to be extremely careful, because if you design it wrong and someone can make money off of the wrong design, they will. And I don't know if you want to respond at all, but I just wanted to throw those perspectives out.
Well, no, my only response would be that thank you for that nice exposition. And from my studies and talking to folks, that's 100% the story that I understand is the right one. I will make the observation about the electricity market in California. Because I'm sort of a troublemaker and arguing about the symmetric safety valve within the economics profession, because it's a new idea. I mean, the environmental advocates have been very poorly received the idea of a symmetric valve. Industry very much likes the idea of a safety valve. I've made these observations, I and some colleagues, that I shared with you today, and so the idea is just penetrating, but it seems to the environmental advocates, it seems well received that a symmetric safety valve would have this virtue. But I will say that there's a funny analogy in thinking about a one-sided safety valve and thinking about the California electricity experience, because like what if, you think about in planning the California electricity market, I think it's fair to say, loosely speaking, looking back, a whole lot of thinking went into, well, what happens when the prices fall? How do we protect generators and the owners of generation when prices fall the way we expect them to fall? And 100% of the program design was organized around that potential eventuality. And there was very little thought given to, well, what happens if prices go up? What happens if all of a sudden, you have natural gas prices go through the roof or something like that? And similarly, in thinking about safety valves, too much thought has been going to thinking about one side of the problem, I think. And as Rich mentioned earlier, a symmetric safety valve might have been it's an interesting thought experiment about how it would have worked in reclaim, in terms of, even given that there had been over-allocation at the beginning, that would have lessened allocation quickly. There would have been a learning, a sort of self-corrective mechanism in the program. Oh, I'm sorry, but okay.
Yeah, let me. My name is Virgil Welch, by the way. I'm with Environmental Defense. In one of your early slides, you pointed out that transaction costs, and I can't recall for which program, were 40% or upwards.
And early bubble and offset programs.
Okay, I'm wondering if you could talk about why, and conversely talk about in the design of programs how you minimize transaction costs for affected entities, and how low, feasibly they can be.
Okay, haven't never been directly involved in brokering trades like this, but I have talked to traders and that were involved in those programs in the 80s. And the reason was that there was just a lot of regulatory oversight, and there had to be governmental pre-approval in each and every trade before the trade could be consummated. And I remember one story where this guy told me that he had gone back and forth between these two firms and the agencies that were involved dozens of times, and he came in with the whole deal ready to go and put it on the desk in front of some vice president. And this guy sat there for 15 minutes, almost in silence for 15 minutes, and said, "John, we're not going to do it." After this broker had had worked so hard to fight, he said, "Why are you not going to do it? We're saving you millions of dollars here." And he said, he just thought, well, the risks are still too great, that there's going to be some kind of ex post take a look at this thing and it's going to be disallowed in the future or whatever. So it really just had to, there's several articles on this that looked at, Yale Law Review had an article in 1990. I could think up the site for you in a few minutes. But there's, that looked at why that program was so cumbersome. And so although it did achieve a lot of savings, Tom Teitenberg has written extensively about this also, achieved a lot of reduction in capital costs, and he estimated that there were nationwide $10 billion in savings. It fell far, far short of what advocates of flexibility were hoping for. So in general, they were kind of looked at as being a failure, not a success. And then along came the cap and trade approach, because there was no cap under those programs. There was no built-in assurance. One of the reasons in the Washington, D.C. context, environmental defense was a leader in promoting the SO2 cap and trade program, and they get a lot of the credit for reconciling differences in the advocacy community around the design of that program in 1990. And one of I think the deal maker from environmental defense's point of view, or EDF at the time, was the cap. The fact that there was going to be an absolute verifiable cap, and economic growth or population growth or whatever was not going to lead to an increase in SO2 emissions going into the future. And that provided a kind of environmental assurance that people were happy about. Okay, sorry.
Yes, my name is Reza Madawi. I'm with the Economic Studies section at ARB. My question is regarding, maybe my suggestion is regarding the initial allocation. The tendency from the previous experience, as you indicated, was that we over-allocated, that the prices fall after that. So if the distribution, initial allowances are distributed based on auction. So the money they collected from that auction can be used to correct the initial allocation by buying back some of the initial allocation and bank it for during the emergency, when the situation like reclaim happens, and you release those during, the oil reserve. We buying reserve for the case of emergency. That type of self-correcting mechanism can be used rather than the later regulation to correct the initial allocation. So that type of mechanism.
I really appreciate the details of that. You'd have to work out, but I appreciate your thinking very much. That's the kind of thinking I have also.
Hi. How does the Northeastern Trading Program address inputs at all in terms of like biomass versus coal or non-biomass type fuels? And since you can't do emission tests to differentiate between the inputs, is there an enforcement mechanism where they can go and look at the inputs to verify one is what they're saying it is?
Well, one of the good things that we have is that commensurate with Title IV was the implementation of a continuous emissions monitoring at all fossil-fired units, and with so there we have, like, on a 15-minute basis, real-time recording of NOx, SOx, and calculation of CO2 emissions. But those calculations are viewed to be very reliable. So so that covers all cases except for the case where you suggest that there's biofuels being used instead, and that's not widespread, but the intent is to give credit for the use of biomass co-firing a coal-fired power plants. And one of the things that I predict, you heard it here first, but one of the things I predict that you're going to get because of the flexibility in our CO2 programs is you're going to get a surprising expansion of the ability to co-fire biofuels with coal. And one of the interesting, I mean, like as mixing of low sulfur and mid sulfur coals. Before I found an engineering article when I had an engineering student doing a literature review for me, and it was said then that Eastern cyclone boilers, and this review in 1989 said that no more than 5% low sulfur coal could be used in an Eastern cyclone boiler, and 5 years later they were using 40%. Because no one had tried. And I think what we're going to see is that there's some understanding about how much biomass could be used in a coal boiler now, and it's, depends on the boiler configuration, but it's between 1 or 2% up to 7 or 8%, or one extreme case 15%. But I think we're going to find a lot of boilers can do several times that. And then how do you verify it? Well, I don't know the implementation detail on that, so that's a valid question. Right. The other thing, though, I'm going to say that one thing that I had to jettison in this presentation was a discussion of offsets. But fortunately, you have Franz Litz coming, and so he can pick up where I've left off in terms of how they're thinking about offsets. It's a little unfortunate. He won't. This is the single most awkward aspect of the RGGI program is the way they're dealing with offsets. The EU ETS allows for offsets. Offsets mean like out of system reductions that give you credit inside the system. So of course carbon capture and sequestration would have to account for this, and biomass use would have to account for this. But the main source right now is that the EU is allowing is the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, which are a heavily overseen and documented procedure to verify emission reductions for investments in the developing world, if you will. Or tree planting or whatever, and there's as hard as it might seem to document and verify that, there's now the pipeline is starting to get big, and a lot of approved CDM projects are coming through now, and it's going to contribute importantly to the EU ETS and how they decide to comply, or how they comply and reach their goals. So anyway, in the RGGI program, they have a schedule about how much offsets are going to be allowed, and if the allowance price is, I can't remember the exact triggers, but if the allowance price hits a certain amount, I think for starters you get to use up to 3.5% offsets within the region. Then if the price is greater than, I think it's $7, you can use up to 7% from anywhere in the country. And then if the price is greater than $10, you can use unlimited amount of offsets from anywhere in the world. It's an interesting kind of a safety valve. Notice how I said the term safety valve gets used in a lot of different ways, and as different people referred to the escape clause in the AB 32 as a safety valve, but there's some kind of price relief mechanism. But what's unfortunate about that RGGI design, and we've tried to point out to them, is that as soon as you jump to anywhere in the world, well, the price of CDM, these clean development mechanism reductions, many people think are going to be less than $10 a ton initially. And so that means you have this, the market won't work because investors are going to end up looking stupid because the price creeps up to 10, and all of a sudden the price of a RGGI allowance will drop back down to some lower level, which is an internationally determined price. That just wasn't fully thought out, I think. But in very many other regards, the RGGI system is really well thought out. Well, the EU doesn't do it directly. There's maybe someone else. I think the IPCC, runs a large, out of Brussels, there's a large process, a lot of people involved doing that kind of verification already. That's already in place. So the RGGI program would take advantage of that.
I just wanted to follow up on something that Mike Scheibel said. First off, there's more complex reasons why the reclaim market failed, but I don't want to go into that. I actually want to talk about where these types of markets have actually succeeded in California. And in particular is the State Water Bank, Drought Water Bank in 1991, 92, and 93. The 91 bank actually had significant problems with it, and they ended up with a significant overrun in costs. But they made corrections in 92 and 94, and it was actually a very successful program in 92 and 94. And that was a new program, market-based program overlaid on regulatory structure. And worked quite well. And it was a fairly simple program in the way it ran. And I think it has a lot of lessons for California, better lessons than maybe from reclaim.
Get back to your safety valve. Just what's the relationship between the auction and the floor?
the relationship between the auction and the floor is, I think I made that link earlier when when asked exactly how would a symmetric safety valve work with where there was this floor, and so how would you implement some sort of reduction in the cap? And one way to do so would be to reduce the number of allowances that were put out through auction if some of the initial distribution is being achieved through an auction. That would be a very easy thing to administratively implement. Now, other people, I could go on and on about some of this stuff, just like talking about what it says in the literature and stuff, but we don't want, that's not very useful. But there has been a concern that, if your mindset is that you're going to give away all these emission allowances for free and that the firms have an entitlement to them, which I've really tried to dislodge that mindset from you. But if that was your mindset, then the idea is that government could reduce that allocation in the future suggests a taking. And so there's been some literature that has dismissed the idea of a symmetric safety valve because it's a taking and the government would have to compensate firms. But I think that's really perverse, the notion that the government, when it tightens the emissions cap, has to compensate firms for some allocation of free emission allowances that were set up under the program in the first place. So I don't encourage you thinking down that path at all. I think it's illogical. So anyway, but so I offer as an alternative, a simpler way to think about it would be, and the first thing I might suggest would be to reduce the number of allowances going into the auction, but you could also very well reduce or devalue the portion of the allocation that's for free going into the future. And the CARE rule, the Clean Air Interstate rule, actually shows you precedent on how to do that because that's kind of the way that thing's getting implemented.
As you know, the California model is going to be all sectors of the economy, not just the electricity sector. And it seems that most of the examples you gave all focused and encompass the electricity sector. So really, how applicable are the lessons learned and the structures that you portrayed to us to other sectors of the economy?
Now, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. And I'm going to be humble in giving you an answer. I talked about lessons learned because all of the important large-scale previous trading programs have been focused on the electricity sector. And there have been some examples where other kinds of incentive-based regulation has worked well, like the water banking program. But I guess the first thing I want to say is, probably the electricity sector will be included. If anyone is regulated, the electricity sector will be regulated, and probably that would be a point of departure. And maybe the program would phase in other sectors. Maybe everybody's in at the beginning, and if California goes that route, that's going to be great. Although I'm not quite sure that I can see through how it would all work. But there's a lot of people smarter than me, and you all working together. Maybe that institution could get designed. I don't know. But what I do know is that there are some lessons of success and we've learned a lot from the previous trading programs as applied to large industrial sources. And those are the lessons I'm trying to make sure that you don't repeat history in terms of where mistakes were made on those previous programs. And in thinking about how other sectors might get, how agriculture and how transportation might get included in the future, I would only be speculating at this point. I mean, I do have some ideas about that, but I think those are the big challenges and the research questions going forward. But I do think it's possible to do so, but I think it's going to have to unfold over time. That's true.
And that's a place to look. Don't think just air. Think
That's true.
water as well. There's a lot in water.
Right. I mean, when I say large industrial sources and electricity generators, right. Hi, Deborah.
Over the past year or so, the EU has seen both a dramatic rise in carbon prices and a sort of quality. Describe, can you tell us your views on what the cause of that was and what lessons we can learn for the design of California intervention?
Well, there's some things you wouldn't want to do that the EU has chosen to do, if you ask me. One of them is that there's very, very limited. On December 31st, 2007, there's a small chance that a lot of investors are going to end up looking really stupid. And that's really bad to put, in my mind, to put a regulation in place of this magnitude that could end up embarrassing decision makers in large firms. But the reason is because on December 31st, 2007, to a large extent, all emission allowances that have been saved are going to suddenly become worthless. So then you can kind of solve backwards and say, well, what's going to happen to the prices before December 31st? If the price is going to go to zero on December 31st, what are you willing to pay on December 30th for an allowance, et cetera? And I think that infuses a price volatility inherently in the system as we move into 2007. The only relief mechanisms for that are that sort of because they're so special anyway, the French and the Polish have decided we're not going to be entirely stupid. We're going to allow banking of allowances if there's been overcompliance in the first phase. Well, that kind of breaks the rules that the EU had set out, and the EU hasn't entirely reconciled how it's going to allow those nations to bank their allowances when no other nations are banking allowances elsewhere. The other thing is the role of CDM. That's the other device that's pointed to these clean development mechanism, is the other transition device that may allow some reconciliation between 2007 and 2008. But there's a lot of it's really unfortunate to just have this wall, and then you're going to start up on January 1st, 2008. Again, there should have been, at least Reclaim, I'll give credit for having anticipated that with overlapping compliance periods. So that's one issue. There was just a lot of learning. You got to just be very generous in thinking about the EU and the mistakes that are made there, because the EU is struggling to translate into their common languages stuff from, from Polish or other smaller languages. And actually, I've talked to folks at the EU, and it turns out that's really actually a problem. And then when they do the translation, it turns out it doesn't mean the same thing as what the member state thought it meant initially and stuff. So there's just a lot of learning. They didn't have any. They've decided. I mentioned Brian McLean at the US EPA, who's a very valuable resource, and they've tried to. The EU has now sort of starting to think about embracing the US EPA's allowance tracking system. The only reason that they haven't done that is the fact that the U.S. isn't playing ball with CO2, so it's kind of embarrassing to take over this software. So they may design their own modeled after the U.S. software, but the registries just didn't exist for allowances in the EU, and so there was no information on what actual emission reductions were being achieved. And when the day of that Black Monday, you all may have heard the anecdote by now, but it actually, the reason that the way that happened was that there was a fair, a convention where different vendors had their booths, and the EU had its booth and was demonstrating the success of have you heard the story? The EU trading system, and somehow, and it was logged into Brussels, and somehow a file got posted that showed the new compliance data that also was from Poland, and that Poland had just found out themselves, oh geez, we have a lot less emissions than we thought we did. They don't have continuous emissions monitoring or place and anything like that. And so this information, and so pretty soon I've heard this story from people who were there, that a group gathered around this booth, and they were looking through the data or whatever, and then people were on their cell phones calling their companies, and then they all bombarded the EU website, and pretty soon the website crashed. And it started this rumor mill of like, all these extra allowances. And so when trading started on after that weekend, the allowance price just was cut in half. That's kind of a growing pain. I mean, that shouldn't have happened in the first place, and hopefully it won't happen again. But you got to be kind of generous, I think, in looking at the EU experience so far, and know that going forward they're figuring this out and doing better and better all the time. So there's some thoughts on it. Yes.
It's kind of on the financial market side. We're fairly fortunate in California to have a couple of big pension programs that could serve some of this banking function, and I'm wondering if there's how they might fit into it by buying additional credits as an investment for part of their portfolio. Has anything ever been done?
I told you that I bought one allowance for the SO2 program, and it didn't really do much for my portfolio. But actually, recently the prices rebounded. So. I'm not sure. In general, some people say that in the RGGI program, for example, a lot of the electricity generators have argued that third parties should not be allowed to buy allowances, because I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense to most people I talk to, and that is not the RGGI approach at all. It's never been the approach in any of the programs so far. So in principle, a pension fund could view that as an investment option. If they did, they'd be much likely to want to do that if there was a safety valve in place, because that would suggest that the value of allowances could never rise above a certain level. But a symmetric safety valve would rectify that, and then it might turn it into a good investment again. So that's a very interesting option. I haven't heard anyone talk about it before.
Okay, with that, we want to bring it to a close. Thank you, Dr. Burtraw, for standing up here for 2 hours and talking.
Good luck, California.
So you've kicked us off well, and thank you very much.